Well, a very significant ruling today in Strasbourg at the European Court of Human Rights. An action was taken by a group of elderly, well-meaning Swiss women against their own government. And the premise was their government had not been cutting carbon emissions sufficiently, not been meeting net zero obligations. Now, you might say, what the hell has this got to do with the European Court of Human Rights? Something that was set up post-war to stop abominations such as the discrimination against the Jews that ended up with the Holocaust. But as I've said to you many, many times in the past, the ECHR is all about judicial activism. It's all about expanding its reach. Well, boy, it did this morning because the European Court of Human Rights has decided that under Article 8 of the Convention, which is the right to life, that actually governments have a duty to protect people from climate change. And most significantly, this ruling is binding and can trickle down to influence the law in all 46 countries that are signed up to ECHR, including the United Kingdom. Yep, the right to respect for private and family life has been used to say that governments have a duty to fight climate change, to meet their net zero obligations. Now, to me, this just says what I've been saying for years anyway, that we should have no part of this thing whatsoever. I think the implications for not just national sovereignty, but for general elections are very, very serious indeed. Well, somebody who may have a slightly different point of view is Tim Crosland, who joins me here, director of Plan B, a charity that uses legal action to tackle climate change. Now, I'd imagine you're delighted.
Certainly am. And one thing we agree with you about is the significance of this ruling.
It's huge.
Because it isn't just those women in Switzerland. As you say, there are 46 countries who are part of the Council of Europe, to be distinguished from the European Union, of course. And this ruling is relevant and binding to all of those countries. So it's hugely significant to those women in Switzerland. It's hugely significant to the people of Switzerland, but it's just as important to people here in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, its linkage to the European Union is actually quite strong. There are interconnecting corridors from the European Parliament straight into the European Court of Human Rights. And, of course, you can't be an EU member without first signing up to ECHR. So they're separate.
It's EU plus, yes.
Yeah, that's right. And we opted with Brexit to stay part of this. Here's the point. Here's the point, Tim, I think that matters. If this court has judged, and I'm going to quote it again, that governments have a duty to protect people from climate change. Now, whatever that means, but we're talking here about the theory that man-made CO2 is leading to global warming. That's what we're talking about.
The scientific evidence we're talking about.
We're talking about the 3% every year of CO2 emissions that are man-made.
Well, that's not what the science says.
And some say 5%.
No, the science says that the climate change that we've seen since 1750 is attributable to human carbon emissions with a high level of certainty. That is what the science says, and it's really
But here's my point. Only 3 to 5% of all CO2 produced every year is produced by man. The rest is naturally occurring. But either way, we can argue that, you and I, until the cows come home. We're not going to do that. We haven't got time. There are other scientists with different points of view, although I would accept there are more scientists who take your side of the argument at the moment.
The scientific consensus.
Yeah, but it's not universal, but there is a consensus amongst many of them. I agree with that. But here's the point. What if I stand for the general election and I say, this is a load of cobblers. This is a complete load of nonsense. CO2's got nothing to do with global warming. It's all about sun activity. And I win a majority in the House of Commons and form a government. What this judgment means is that I won't be allowed to carry out the will of the people if I stay a signatory to the ECHR.
That is the rule of law that you've just described. We have democracy and the rule of law. And the point of the rule of law is that the powerful are held to account, the vulnerable are protected, and we have a law that protects people's right to family life, their right to health. That falls within the scope of Article 8. And it's not so different from all the other international agreements we have, whether around nuclear proliferation, whether around free trade. We have international agreements around those things.
So should we just scrap elections and just say, ECHR, you tell us what to do, boys, and we're happy with that?
Well, of course not. But this is an act of Parliament, the Human Rights Act, that was voted on by our parliamentarians with a huge level of support.
In the last century, you know, time has moved on since the Human Rights Act. Time has moved on a lot since the incorporation of the ECHR over 75 years ago. You see, the point I'm making, Tim, is whatever points of view we have on this, and we disagree, should a court in Strasbourg, made up of people, most of whom aren't even legally qualified, they're jurists, it's this very strange European concept, should they be able to overrule the wishes of the British electorate and the British government?
Well, but they haven't done, because this is an act of Parliament, and as you mentioned in your opening to this,
yep,
the European Convention on Human Rights was established by Britain, amongst others, in the aftermath of the Second World War.
Years ago.
So this is a treaty negotiated by our government, brought into domestic law by the British Parliament, and if Parliament chooses to do something about that, well, then it can, but it must deal with the consequences of being an international pariah. The only country to have left this in recent years is Russia. And if we want to put ourselves into that camp, well, so be it. But that's a matter for Parliament.
We're the first country since Greenland to leave the European Union. I mean, you know, countries make decisions. I mean, I was brought up to believe that no Parliament may bind its successor. That the whole point of elections was you could change the laws under which you live by voting differently at the next general election. I think this somewhat undermines that.
I think we should talk a little bit about the proposition behind this,
yep,
which is the duty of a government to protect its people. That doesn't seem to me a particularly radical proposition if the scientific consensus is the climate crisis is an immense danger, not just in the future, but now. And one of the important things about the Switzerland case was those women in their 70s and 80s, they weren't talking about models or predicted impacts. No. They were talking about the impact on them right now from unprecedented heat waves in Switzerland. Wow. One of the claimants had died in the meantime. But that is what this is about. It's about protecting the public. It's about protecting the public from rising food prices.
Playing God. It's about playing God. It's about pretending that we, by closing all our factories down, can change the weather. It's nonsense.
Well, that's your anti-scientific consensus view. Okay. It is not what the science says. What the science says is that Britain has lost 40% of its wheat crop due to the climate crisis. That's not prediction, it's fact. What we're seeing is around the country, homes becoming uninsurable because they've been flooded so often, you can't get insurance anymore.
Tim, this has been happening all through the millennia, where climates have changed. I want to put this point to you, a slightly different point, but an important point, I think. There is, as you know, a general election coming up in India this year. Narendra Modi, hoping to get in for a third term, favourite to do so at the moment. He put this tweet out the other day, and it's his big boast, vote for me. And the tweet is very, very strong. It says, a remarkable feat, crossing 1 billion tonnes in coal and lignite production marks a historic milestone for India, reflecting our commitment to ensuring a vibrant coal sector. So here we have India, with 1.4 billion people, boasting that they're now themselves mining over 1 billion tonnes of coal a year and burning it in their own country. We have the fact that China has put out more CO2 in the last 10 years than we ever have since our nation was founded. The real point of this is that our CO2 commitments, our net zero commitments, are deindustrialising our countries, putting huge bills on ordinary consumers, when Indonesia, India and China dwarf anything that we're doing. Are we not handicapping ourselves all the while India and countries like that are doing what they're doing?
The City of London is financing 15% of global carbon emissions around the world.
15?
We live in a 15%.
Yeah.
We live in a globalised economy.
Yes.
A lot of those fossil fuel projects around the world are supported by our lawyers, our bankers, our financiers, our insurers.
Yeah.
So we're part of all of this. Separating
We're a
out
tiny part of it.
15%, a tiny part of it.
Well, even 15%. Look, the
of
point,
global emissions, is that a tiny part of it, really?
we will burn 4 billion tonnes of coal this year in the world. 4 billion tonnes of coal. And here we have the ECHR telling us that no future British government, all the while we keep the Human Rights Act, no future British government can change policy.
That's not what it's saying. It's saying there's an obligation on governments to protect their people from scientifically established threats. That's what it's saying. And it's not prescriptive in any way. It specifically says we cannot tell the government how to implement this.
No.
All we can do, is direct the government to follow the science.
Yeah.
And the science says that the British public is in serious danger beyond 1.5 degrees of warming. Therefore, the British government must play its part in aligning its policies to that goal.
Tim Crosland, we agree on the significance of this ruling. We may disagree on its implication, but I thank you for coming in and debating it. And folks, you know, as I always say to you, here on GB News, you will hear all sides of every argument, but we think, ultimately, you're big enough and ugly enough to make your own minds up. In a minute, GB News' political editor, Christopher Hope,